I want you to imagine for a moment that being an anxious adventurer may not be such a bad thing. Now, I know what you may be thinking. Having anxiety or being stressed is not a healthy way to live, and I totally agree. If you have anxiety or panic attacks on the regular, you definitely want to seek out the help you need so you can cope and function in this world. However, what I'm talking about is how having just a little bit of anxiety may not be such a bad thing when it comes to travel. Hello, and welcome to the Anxious Adventurer Podcast. I'm Katie Schlegel, your host, and I'm sure you know this by now, but if you don't, I have a little confession to make. I totally get anxious when I travel, and I'm what you call an anxious adventurer. I know that may sound contradicting, but I'm here to tell you that if the thought of traveling somewhere brings up those feelings of anxiety or stress, you've come to the right place. I've traveled to over 17 countries around the world. I've lived in Buenos Aires, Argentina, and trekked across South America solo. I don't say these things to impress you. No, that is not what I'm here for. I say these things to let you know that every single one of those experiences had moments where my anxiety made me feel like I could not do it. So if that's how you feel or have ever felt, you're not alone. I read a great quote recently, and it said this: "Your perspective will either become your prison or your passport." Stephen Furtick. I want to be clear on this, and I don't think I've said this yet, but being an anxious adventurer is not a bad thing. In fact, you shouldn't even try to hide it if you are one. After some practice, I like to think of it more like my superpower. I know that may sound crazy to you, but as I do this podcast, I'm finding more and more research on how having some anxiety, especially when faced in a stressful situation, isn't necessarily a bad thing and can actually be helpful. That's right. I bet you never thought of your anxiousness as being helpful. Now, did you? I know I sure didn't. But as I play out these stories from my travels, I'm seeing more and more how amazing it can actually be to be an anxious adventurer. So if you ever thought your anxiety to be a bad thing, flip that frown upside down and start to see the ways it has actually helped you. If you don't believe me, that's okay. I'll keep popping in some research from time to time that I've found all about this very thing. In fact, in today's episode, I'll give you your first insights into how being an anxious adventurer can benefit you in your pursuit of traveling. So put those passports away this week and grab a cuppa, like my friends in the UK and Australia like to say. Because in this episode, we're going to work on changing that perspective you may have on being an anxious adventurer. And my hope is that by the end of this episode, your perspective will change from having your anxiousness be your prison to it becoming your passport to the world and the many places you can travel with it. If you haven't noticed by now, I'm a silver lining type of gal. I've always been that way, and if something bad happens, while I do allow myself to go through all the emotions, around 99% of the time, I ultimately come to a positive conclusion and try to see how I can learn from what happened, or at least have a hope that there is something good that will be coming from the bad. What I want to instill in you in this episode is how being an anxious adventurer can actually help you be a really good traveler. As I was doing research on anxiety and how it's affecting us worldwide, I also took a look at the other side of the coin and did some research on if anyone is looking at how it can be a good thing, or if there's anything good that can come from being anxious. Before I dive into what I found, I was curious about the definition of two words, anxious and adventure, to see if there was anything I could glean from the name of this podcast. So I looked up the meanings of each word, and what I found was actually quite surprising. From the Oxford Dictionary, the word anxious means experiencing worry, unease, or nervousness, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. And the word adventure means to engage in hazardous and exciting activity, especially the exploration of unknown territory. Okay, I didn't like the word hazardous so much, but there are two words that I want you to note from those two definitions: uncertain and unknown. Typically, your anxiety or fear kicks in when you're faced with something that's uncertain or with an unknown outcome. I came across a 2023 article from the New York Times where the woman who wrote it was talking about her fear of driving. And before even getting too far into the piece, she mentioned how her driver instructor talked about fear being a good thing. He said this: "The fear never leaves you. You have to learn to harness it. Have just enough fear to stay alert and be aware of your surroundings, but not so much that it is making you overly hesitant." The idea of not having to totally erase her fear was so freeing to her, and that is what I want you to take away from this episode. Your anxiety or fear when traveling may never leave you. You just have to learn how to harness it so that you can then turn it into your very own superpower. So if you look at being an anxious adventurer in this context, then I have good news for you. You don't have to erase your anxiety completely. You can actually use your anxiousness to your advantage while traveling. Now, I couldn't find too much information on this specifically, so what I'm doing here is taking what I did find and adapting it to travel situations. Here's how. First, you want to use the adrenaline. Often, when anxiety kicks in while traveling, it can give you a surge of adrenaline, and that's a good thing. You want to have a little bit of anxiety when you're exploring and traveling because it keeps you alert and aware of your surroundings. It keeps you on your toes, so to speak. What you want to do is try to find that sweet spot so you can hone in on it. Research shows that when stress hormones are slightly elevated, your learning increases and it can enhance performance. In the world of travel, that means you're going to be excellent at navigating yourself through any situation your adventure throws your way. Next, reframe your anxiety. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Dr. Wayne Dyer. Anxiety is not always a negative thing. However, telling yourself anxiety is a bad thing and trying to avoid it completely may end up making the problem worse. Here's an example of reframing your anxiety. Rather than saying, "I am so nervous about this trip," try saying, "I'm so excited about this trip." Research shows that these two emotions can often feel the same in the body. So when you have that stomach-churning feeling when you start to think about your upcoming trip, try to change the way you look at it and reframe your state of mind, and then see if that feeling changes. Accept that anxiety may be inevitable. As we talked about a little earlier, trying to eliminate your anxiety completely can create an even grander sense of anxiety. The task of totally ridding yourself of something, like your anxiety, is really overwhelming. So much so that you may end up giving up on your aspirations to travel before you even begin, because there's just no way your anxiety will ever go away completely. Instead, try to accept that anxiety may be inevitable on your adventures and part of the experience. In other words, welcome it and give it permission to exist. The more you start to see those anxious feelings as routine and par for the course, the less power your anxiety can have on you. Try to remember that anxiety and fear are natural reactions. If you're able to, choose to focus on the task at hand rather than the fear related to it. And if you can't quiet your mind long enough to do so, here's a trick. Tell yourself, either silently or aloud, "Well, we'll cross that bridge when we get there." I use this when my mind starts to go down the rabbit hole of what ifs. Saying or thinking this usually stops that overactive thinking right in its tracks. And lastly, channel the anxiety into motivation. Find your anxiety sweet spot, channel it, and use it to motivate you during your adventures. Research shows most people have an anxiety sweet spot where they have just enough anxiety to feel alert, but not enough to feel debilitated. In this state, anxiety can be an excellent motivator. For example, if you're worried about getting robbed while traveling, take some time beforehand to figure out what you could do so you're prepared if the situation arises. Or maybe you're worried about getting lost. You can download a city map on your phone or get a city guide so you have it with you wherever you go. Anxiety often results from some sort of uncertainty about the future. In traveling, perhaps you start to worry about the outcome of your trip. This is when you can remind yourself of why you wanted to travel in the first place. Remember that episode on finding your why? This is where it can come in handy. Remember, whatever it is you're worrying about, your anxiety can often push you to do something about it, which is a good thing, as it makes you an excellent traveler because you will be so prepared. When you give your travel anxiety permission to exist, oftentimes you can better deal with the many different situations that will come your way during your travels, thus allowing yourself to take hold of that passport rather than living in that prison and turning that anxiety of yours into your very own superpower. I want you to know that you are not the only one going through these things when you travel. My hope is that this podcast can give us all the inspiration we need to step out into the unknown and go on our next adventures. I'm not a medical doctor, and if you have an anxiety disorder, please seek out the help you need. The tips and information stated in these episodes are not meant to replace any medical treatment or therapy for anxiety or stress disorders. These episodes are meant to be additions and layers that you can add on top of what you're already doing. Sometimes seeing things differently is just what you need to unlock that part of you so you can truly step into your power and become a brave, albeit anxious adventurer. If you have someone you think would benefit from hearing today's episode, I encourage you to share it with them. The more the merrier. And we need more brave, anxious adventurers out there, rallying together. And just a reminder, please follow, subscribe, and hit those 5 stars if you like this podcast. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. I'd love to hear your feedback, and if you leave a 5-star review, I'll for sure give you a shout out. Before I close out this episode, there are a few things I want to remind you of. The I Stand for Girls campaign is going strong, and you can still contribute to this amazing cause until the end of September. There are 2 ways you can show your support. 1, you can donate directly to Carranza, either by sponsoring a girl's education with a monthly donation or a one-time donation. 2, if you'd like to support this cause by purchasing a Balinese friendship bracelet made by artisans Lu and YN in Bali, you can do that too. Either one of those ways would be amazing. Both of these links are in the show notes, so check those out. And if you're wondering what I'm even talking about here, check out the last episode, episode 17, where I tell you all about it and we travel to Mozambique together. Oh, and one last thing. Be sure to follow me on Instagram at Mariposa Skies. That's where I share all the photographs, videos, and visuals for the podcast, information about the artisans and their fashion, travel inspiration and tips, as well as cultural knowledge and insights. This month I've been sharing a lot of content about Carranza and the I Stand for Girls campaign. So if you want to learn more about it, be sure to come on over and give me a follow. I hope to see you there. As always, thank you for joining me today. I hope you learned a little, maybe you laughed a little, but my hope is that it gave you some things to think about. So until next time, my dear, brave, anxious adventurers. Ciao. Besos. Mwah.